The sound of muffled sobs broke through the stillness of the night. Alma, an elderly woman well into her 70s, woke up with a start. Someone was crying, a faint, pained sound that cut through the silence. Bracing herself against the cold, she ventured outside and saw a small girl curled up at the base of a tree, her face streaked with tears. "Please help me," the child's desperate voice quivered, eyes wide with fear. Alma didn't know what kind of story she had just stepped into, but she was certain that this night would change everything. Was she ready to face the darkness that awaited? Alma's heart pounded as she sat up, a weight pressing down on her chest as if a nightmare had come to life. She strained to listen, trying to separate the sobs from the wind whistling outside her window. But the more she listened, the clearer it became. The crying was real, the voice unmistakably that of a child. With the careful, deliberate movements of someone her age, Alma got out of bed, her frail legs unsteady yet driven by an unyielding resolve. She moved to the window, gently drawing the curtain aside so as not to make a sound. Under the dim streetlight, she spotted a small figure huddled on the edge of the road. Without a moment's hesitation, Alma wrapped herself in a thick cardigan and stepped outside. The girl stood there, shivering in the chill night air, her large eyes wide with terror as Alma approached. "Are you all right?" Alma asked, her voice soft but laden with concern. The girl flinched but didn't run. As Alma drew nearer, the girl whispered, "I can't stay there anymore. I'm scared." "What's your name?" Alma asked, lowering herself to meet the girl's eye level. "I'm Ellie," she murmured, barely audible. "I live in the house across the street, but I don't want to go back. My stepmother will hurt me." Ellie's words struck Alma like a dagger to the heart, sparking a fierce, protective instinct she hadn't felt since her husband passed away. Alma led Ellie into her warm home and quietly brewed a cup of ginger tea. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, her eyes darting nervously around as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "What does your stepmother do to you?" Alma asked gently, fear tightening her voice at what the answer might be. "My stepmother makes me do chores all day," Ellie said, her eyes red and swollen. "She yells, scolds, and hits me if I don't do exactly what she wants. I told my dad, but he didn't believe me." Alma felt her eyes well up. She pulled Ellie into a hug, feeling the girl's small body tremble against hers. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Alma whispered. "I'll protect you." Ellie looked up at Alma, her eyes brimming with gratitude and hope, two things she had long been without. "Can I stay here with you?" she asked, her voice laced with desperation. "You can stay tonight," Alma said, her tone firm but full of emotion. "Tomorrow we'll figure something out." They sat together in the comforting darkness of Alma's home. For the first time in years, Alma felt a warmth spreading through her heart. The next morning, Alma escorted Ellie back to her house, determined to assess the situation. As they approached, Alma saw Miranda standing on the porch, arms crossed and her expression stony. She was tall, with thick black hair falling over her shoulders, but her sharp features and cold eyes betrayed no kindness. "Where have you been all night?" Miranda's voice was harsh, ignoring Alma's presence entirely. Ellie looked down, stammering, I just wanted to go for a walk." Miranda's gaze shifted to Alma, eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" she demanded icily. Alma did not flinch. "I'm your neighbor," she replied, meeting Miranda's stare. "I found Ellie on the street last night. She was terrified." Miranda's lips twisted into a mocking smile. "Stay out of my business," she said coldly. "Ellie is my responsibility, not yours." She yanked Ellie's arm, making the girl stumble. "Get inside," Miranda barked. Ellie cast a pleading glance at Alma, but Alma could only watch helplessly as the door slammed shut. A heavy sadness settled in Alma's chest. She knew Miranda was far from a fit guardian, and that Ellie was enduring more suffering than she let on. That night, Alma stood at her window, her eyes fixed on the house across the street where dim light seeped through tightly drawn curtains. She imagined Ellie being scolded, the sharp tones of Miranda's voice blending with the muffled sound of Ellie's frightened sobs echoing in her mind. The crying was more than just noise, it was a cry for help, the deep-seated fear of a hurt child. Alma felt a shiver run through her, not from the cold but from the anger and helplessness churning inside her. As the night deepened, Alma knew sleep would not come. She resolved to do something to protect Ellie. Alma decided that she could not abandon Ellie. She began researching child protection agencies and how to report cases of abuse. She contacted a local organization and arranged a meeting with a lawyer to discuss Ellie's situation. "We'll help her," the lawyer said with firm resolve. "But you'll need to gather enough evidence of the abuse to convince the court." Alma knew this battle would not be easy, but she was determined not to back down. Alma's small kitchen, always filled with the comforting scent of herbal tea and freshly baked pastries, was quiet this morning. Ellie sat at the table, staring out the window, haunted by her stepmother's angry words. Alma tried to reach out to Ellie. Sitting across from her, she carefully poured tea into a cup, her voice gentle but full of deep concern. "Do you want to tell me anything?" Ellie bit her lip, hesitated for a moment, and then looked at Alma with tear-filled eyes. "I'm so scared, Mrs. Alma," she admitted in a small voice. "Stepmother is always angry, and I don't know what I did wrong." "You haven't done anything wrong," Alma reassured her. "Sometimes people hurt others without a valid reason, but you have to remember, it's not your fault." Alma took a cookie from the plate and gently placed it in Ellie's hand. "Did you know, when I was young, I used to feel very lonely too," she said softly. "But I learned that true love never causes pain, and I promise I will always be here to listen and protect you." Ellie took a bite of the cookie, her eyes shimmering with newfound trust and emotion. "I never thought anyone would really care about me," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for being here." Alma smiled, her eyes misty. "You don't need to thank me, Ellie," she whispered. "Because from now on, we're a little family." That evening, Alma and Ellie sat by the small fire, reading fairy tales from an old book Alma had kept from her youth. "This is the book my mom used to read to me," Ellie said, her voice catching in her throat. Alma placed her hand gently on Ellie's shoulder, feeling the tension and vulnerability within the girl. "We'll read it every night," she said tenderly, "so you'll never feel alone again." On a winter morning, pale sunlight filtered through the gray clouds. Alma sat in her old rocking chair on the porch, her eyes constantly drawn to Miranda's house. She could feel the suffocating tension and growing unease coming from Ellie's home. Ellie continued to come to Alma's house every afternoon after school, but the worry in her eyes seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. "Stepmother is angrier than before," she whispered to Alma one dreary afternoon. Alma nodded, feeling the fear in Ellie's voice. "I know. But you need to remember that I'm always here, ready to protect you," she reassured her. Ellie gave a faint smile, a glimmer of trust flickering in her eyes. "I just wish I could stay here forever," she said softly, her voice full of longing. One afternoon, as Alma and Ellie were sitting on the porch sipping tea, Miranda suddenly appeared at the door. She didn't wait for an invitation and strode right in, her gaze cold and direct as it met Alma's. "What do you think you're doing with my girl?" Miranda demanded, her voice laced with fury. Unfazed, Alma set her teacup down on the table and looked Miranda in the eye. "I'm just making sure Ellie is safe," she said calmly. Miranda scoffed, disdain etched into her features. "Who do you think you are?" "Her mother," she spat sarcastically. "You have no right to meddle in my family's affairs." Ellie shrank behind Alma, her whole body trembling with fear. "I don't want to go back with her," she said in a small voice, but loud enough for Miranda to hear. At that, Miranda's eyes flared with rage. "You be quiet," she barked, stepping quickly toward Ellie. But Alma moved in front of the girl, placing steady hands on Ellie's shoulders. "You can't force her to do something she doesn't want," Alma said, her voice firm. "If you're looking for a fight, find someone else. I won't let you hurt Ellie anymore." Miranda slammed her hand onto the table, making the teacups rattle. "You think you're strong," she shouted, her voice dripping with spite. "You're just a lonely old woman." Alma met Miranda's eyes with unwavering resolve and compassion. "I may be nobody, but I won't stand by and watch a child be hurt," she said, her tone steady and powerful. Miranda flinched at Alma's words, though she quickly masked her surprise. She turned to Ellie, her voice now more urgent. "Ellie, you need to come home. I only want what's best for you." Ellie took a step back, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "No, I don't want to go," she said, her voice small but determined. "Mrs. Alma is kind to me, and she never makes me afraid." Miranda's face flushed with rage, her eyes blazing with hostility. "You'll regret interfering in my affairs," she threatened before storming out, leaving Alma and Ellie standing in silence, watching her retreat. Ellie sat down on the chair, her small shoulders trembling with worry. Alma gently sat beside her, wrapping an arm around the girl. "You were very brave," she said with tender warmth. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." "But I'm scared that my stepmother won't stop," Ellie confessed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She'll find a way to hurt me." Alma stroked Ellie's hair, her eyes glistening with determination. "She may threaten, but she can't do anything if we don't let her," she said, her voice full of encouragement. "You have me, and we will face whatever comes together." Ellie felt a slight relief wash over her, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I just want a peaceful life," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "And you will have one," Alma replied, her eyes full of conviction. "I promise to do everything I can to protect you." After the tense confrontation with Miranda, Alma realized she could no longer stay passive. She knew she needed to act decisively to shield Ellie from threats and abuse. Sitting down with Ellie, Alma took her hand and said, "We will reach out to the lawyer, and I will fight for the right to protect you." Ellie shook her head, her voice wavering. "But will anyone believe me?" Stepmother always says no one will believe what I say. Alma squeezed her hand, her gaze steady and resolute. You need to believe in yourself first. You were brave enough to speak the truth, and that's what matters most, she encouraged. I will fight with you, so you won't have to face this alone. Ellie nodded, her eyes sparkling with newfound trust and hope. I'll try to be stronger, she said, her voice full of determination. One cold winter afternoon, Alma sat in her cozy kitchen, trying to focus on knitting a new scarf for Ellie. But worry weighed heavily on her, images of Ellie's fearful eyes flashing through her mind whenever Miranda gripped her wrist tightly. Suddenly there was a sharp knock at the door. Startled, Alma stood up and quickly walked to the entrance. When she opened it, she saw a man she didn't recognize standing there, his face tense and serious. Are you Mrs. Alma? He asked, his voice grave. Yes, I am Alma, she replied cautiously. Who are you? I'm David, Ellie's father, the man said. I need to talk to you about Ellie. David sat across from Alma in her small kitchen. I know Miranda isn't the best mother, David admitted, his eyes avoiding Alma's gaze. But I didn't know how to protect Ellie. Alma felt anger bubbling inside her, but she tried to stay composed. Do you know what Ellie has been through? She asked, her voice trembling. She's terrified at the mere mention of Miranda's name. David sighed, his head hanging low. I know, and I feel guilty. But I haven't had the courage to stand up to Miranda. Now is the time to do so, Alma said, her eyes locking onto David's. Ellie needs you more than ever. David was silent for a long moment before nodding. I'll try. I don't want to lose her. This meeting marked a turning point in Alma and Ellie's journey. David began participating in the legal process to secure Ellie's safety. Despite his involvement, Alma remained wary of this sudden shift. Did he genuinely want to protect Ellie, or was he merely trying to regain control? Ellie, too, felt surprised and somewhat uneasy seeing David again. Do you really want to help me? She asked, her eyes wide with doubt. David nodded, his expression filled with remorse. I was wrong, Ellie. But I want to start over. I want to believe you, Ellie said softly. But I don't know if I can. As night fell, Alma's small house lay quiet under the dark sky. The wind howled against the window panes, creating a sound that seemed to echo Ellie's silent fears. Her room, though warm and secure, couldn't fully erase the shadows of trauma etched into her mind. Ellie curled up under her blanket, her eyes drifting toward the window wide with anxious vigilance, as if bracing for an unseen threat. I won't be afraid, she whispered to herself. But even her own voice sounded small and quivering. Sleep came fitfully, and soon Ellie was pulled into a familiar nightmare. She found herself trapped in a pitch-black room with no way out. Miranda's yelling resounded, growing louder and more menacing. Ellie, you must obey, the voice shrieked like a monster's roar, jolting Ellie awake. She sat up abruptly, sweat drenching her forehead and ragged breaths filling the dark room. Her heart pounded wildly, and she broke down, sobbing at the relentless fear that never seemed to fade. Hearing her cries, Alma rushed into the room, pushing the door open. The dim glow of the nightlight fell on Ellie's tear-streaked face, her eyes puffy and red. I had a nightmare, Ellie sobbed, her voice trembling. Alma said nothing at first. She simply sat down beside Ellie and wrapped her in a warm embrace. You're okay now, she whispered, her voice gentle yet resolute. I'm here. Alma smoothed down Ellie's disheveled hair and began to share her own story. You know, Ellie, she started, her voice low and reflective. I used to have nightmares like that when I was little. Ellie looked up at Alma, surprise and curiosity mingling in her eyes. Really? You were scared like me? Alma nodded, her gaze distant as if recalling painful memories long buried. When I was a child, I lost my mother in an accident. Ever since then, I had nightmares about being abandoned, about having no one there to protect me. Ellie listened quietly, feeling a deep sense of connection and comfort. How did you get through those nightmares? She asked, her voice soft. Alma smiled, her eyes filled with a tender hope. I learned to face my fear instead of running from it, she explained. And I believe you can do the same, because you're a brave girl. Ellie nodded slightly, a warmth beginning to spread through her heart. I'll try to be stronger, she said, her eyes glistening with newfound determination. Alma hugged Ellie tightly, her hand patting the girl's back to reassure her. You know, Ellie, we all have our fears, she whispered, but the important thing is that we don't face them alone. You have me and I have you. Ellie felt trust swell within her. She leaned into Alma's embrace, her tears drying on her cheeks. I've never felt this loved before, she admitted, her voice full of emotion. Alma smiled, her own eyes brimming with tears. And I never thought I'd find joy and hope again at my age, she said, her voice thick with emotion. To help Ellie overcome her fears, Alma decided to guide her through some mental exercises. We'll practice breathing together for the times when you feel anxious, she said, leading Ellie through slow and steady breathing exercises. Ellie followed Alma's instructions, taking deep breaths and feeling the air fill her chest. I feel better now, she admitted after a moment of practice. Sometimes, just one deep breath is enough to soothe the soul, Alma explained. Fear is a part of us, but we have the power to control it, not let it take over our lives. After calming down, Ellie lay back down on the bed, and Alma remained by her side, holding her hand. You were so brave, Alma said, her eyes filled with love. And I'm proud of you. I just want peace, Ellie whispered. I just want a safe home where I don't have to be afraid of anyone. And this is your safe home, Alma replied, her eyes shining with strong conviction. I promise I will always protect you no matter what happens. Ellie smiled, and her eyes slowly closed in peace. That night, she slept soundly in Alma's arms, truly feeling safe for the first time in the warm, cozy house. As Ellie drifted into a deep sleep, Alma sat by her side, silently watching over her. She felt both relieved and anxious, relieved that Ellie had managed to overcome another nightmare, but anxious about what the future might hold. Alma knew that the legal battle and conflicts with Miranda still lay ahead. Yet, looking at Ellie's peaceful face as she slept, Alma was certain she had made the right choice. She was determined never to let fear or abuse touch this child again. We will make it through, Alma whispered, her eyes steely with resolve. Because love will always be the greatest strength. On the day of the first court hearing, the courtroom buzzed with tense anticipation. Alma entered with Ellie, who trembled and clung tightly to her hand. Around them, curious eyes watched and whispers rippled among court staff, lawyers, and Miranda's gathered family members. Alma leaned down to Ellie, her voice gentle but steady. Remember, there's nothing to be afraid of. We just need to tell the truth, she said. Ellie nodded, though her eyes still brimmed with worry. I'll try, Grandma Alma, she whispered. As the hearing began, Alma's lawyer, Susan, started by presenting the background of Ellie's life before she found refuge with Alma. Ellie lived in fear and abuse under the care of her stepmother, Miranda, Susan stated with persuasive conviction. She has found safety and love with Mrs. Alma, and we believe that staying with her is in Ellie's best interest. Susan called on several witnesses to testify, from neighbors to social workers who had interacted with Ellie. The first to testify was Mrs. Linda, a neighbor. Ellie is a sweet, well-mannered girl, Mrs. Linda said, her voice full of compassion. But I've heard yelling and crying coming from Miranda's house many times. It's something no child should have to endure. Miranda's lawyer, Mr. Parker, interrupted and asked with a mocking tone, Mrs. Linda, did you personally witness what you just described? No, but the shouting was very clear, Mrs. Linda replied with a confident expression. And I know that Ellie came to Mrs. Alma's house out of fear. When it was Ellie's turn to testify, she walked slowly, her legs trembling. The judge looked at Ellie with an encouraging expression. What is your name, he asked. I'm Ellie, she replied. Her voice soft but clear enough for the room to hear. Susan stepped forward, smiling at Ellie. Ellie, can you tell the court about your life before you met Mrs. Alma? Ellie took a deep breath and began to describe what she had endured. My stepmother often hit and yelled at me when I didn't do what she wanted, she said, her voice trembling but steady. I was very scared, and I didn't know how to get away from it. Lawyer Parker stood up to cross-examine Ellie, his face showing little sympathy. Ellie, are you exaggerating to make your stepmother look bad, he asked. Ellie looked at Parker, her eyes brimming with tears, but she did not waver. I'm not lying, she asserted. I just want to stay with Mrs. Alma, where I feel safe. Parker pressed on, so can you prove what you're saying? Are there any witnesses who saw this? Ellie lowered her head, pain evident in her eyes. I don't have proof, but it's the truth, she said, her voice breaking. Susan stepped in to defend Ellie. We cannot expect a child to have proof of the abuse they've experienced, she said firmly. Ellie has been brave enough to share her story, and that should be respected. When it was Miranda's turn to testify, she appeared confident and composed. I have always done what's best for the girl, Miranda said in a confident tone. I only wanted to teach her discipline and proper behavior. Susan continued to question Miranda, leading her to admit that she had hit Ellie before. But that was to teach her. Miranda defended herself. Sometimes children need to be disciplined strictly. Susan did not accept this justification. Hitting is never the right way to discipline a child, she countered. Ellie is a sensitive and vulnerable child, and what she needs is love, not punishment. Miranda's brow furrowed, and her eyes flashed with anger. Mrs. Alma is just a lonely old woman, Miranda said with a voice full of scorn. She can't provide for Ellie the way I can. The judge interrupted Miranda, his voice calm yet firm. This is not about financial status, he said. It is about providing a safe and healthy environment for the child. Just when everyone thought the trial was nearing its conclusion, David unexpectedly took the stand as a new witness. I know I have failed in my duty as a father, he said, his voice deep and filled with regret, but I cannot sit by and let Ellie endure any more suffering from Miranda. David's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. especially for Miranda, who glared at him in fury and tried to interrupt. However, Susan, the lawyer, prevented her from doing so. "We believe David's testimony is crucial to ensuring Ellie's protection," she stated. David went on to admit that Miranda had abused Ellie multiple times, expressing his deep remorse for not stepping in sooner. "I just want to make things right and do what's best," he said, his eyes glistening with tears. After hearing all the testimonies and reviewing the evidence, the judge temporarily granted Alma custody of Ellie until the next court date. This ruling brought a sense of relief to Alma and Ellie, though it was also a stark reminder that the battle was far from over. Outside the courtroom, Ellie clung tightly to Alma, her eyes filled with tears of hope. "I know we did the right thing," she said, her voice resolute. Alma held her close, her voice breaking with emotion. "You are the bravest girl I have ever known," she said. "We'll fight this together until the end." The days following the initial court hearing were tense for Alma and Ellie. Although the judge had temporarily awarded Alma custody, she knew the fight was not yet over. In Alma's warm kitchen, Ellie sat at the table, her eyes thoughtful as she gazed out the window. "I'm still afraid my stepmother will find a way to take me back," she whispered, her voice heavy with worry. Alma sat down beside Ellie, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to be afraid," she said firmly. "I will do everything to protect you." Ellie nodded slightly, but the fear was still evident in her eyes. One afternoon, as Ellie left school and was about to step away from the gate, Miranda suddenly appeared. She moved swiftly toward Ellie, grabbing her arm and yanking it hard. "Ellie, you're coming home with me now," Miranda shouted, her voice full of anger and determination. Ellie recoiled, trying to pull away but unable to break free. "No, I don't want to go with you," she cried, tears welling up in her eyes. The commotion drew the attention of a passerby, Mr. Michael, a middle-aged man with a kind but strong presence. He quickly intervened. "What are you doing? It's clear that the girl doesn't want to go with you." Miranda turned to Michael, her eyes blazing with hostility. "She's my daughter, and I have every right to take her home," she retorted angrily. Michael stood firm. "But if she doesn't want to go, you have no right to force her," he said decisively. "I'll call the police if necessary." Miranda released Ellie's arm, but her eyes were still smoldering with rage. "This isn't over," she warned before turning and walking away. Ellie ran to Michael, her whole body trembling. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Michael bent down, his eyes full of empathy. "It's okay, you're safe now," he reassured her. When Alma heard about the incident, she immediately contacted the police. Miranda violated the temporary restraining order against approaching Ellie, she explained firmly. "We need to take action to prevent her from doing this again." Officer Lee assured Alma that they would increase monitoring and suggested applying for a long-term restraining order against Miranda. "We'll do everything we can to protect her," he confirmed. "You can rest assured." Although she knew Ellie was safe in her home, Alma couldn't help but feel anxious. "Are you sure you're okay, Ellie?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. Ellie managed a faint smile. "I just need you here with me. And that's enough," she said, her voice filled with trust. After the incident, Alma realized she had to be even more prepared for the upcoming legal battle. She met with Susan, the lawyer, to discuss the next steps. "We need to be ready for the possibility that Miranda will use every tactic to regain custody," Susan said gravely. "We must gather enough evidence and witnesses to convince the judge that the best place for Ellie is with you." Alma nodded, her eyes full of determination. "I won't let Miranda win," she stated. "Ellie has suffered enough." Ellie overheard the conversation between Alma and Susan, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I will try to be stronger," she whispered to herself. "I will fight to protect my new life." In the following days, Alma and Ellie focused on gathering evidence and preparing for the final court hearing. They faced pressure not only from Miranda but also from the surrounding community. News of the case began to spread, attracting the attention of reporters and journalists. "Are you worried?" Ellie asked one evening as they sat together in the cozy kitchen. Alma smiled, taking Ellie's hand. "I am, but I also have faith," she said warmly. "Because we are doing what's right." Ellie became more active in preparing for the trial. She practiced questions and answers with Susan, the lawyer, to be ready for the cross-examination from Miranda's lawyer. "Are you sure you want to testify?" Susan asked, her eyes reflecting concern. "This will be a big challenge for you." Ellie nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I don't want to stay silent anymore," she said. "I want to speak the truth." Alma felt a swell of pride as she watched Ellie grow braver by the day. "You are a courageous girl," she said with emotion in her voice. "I am so proud of you." One day, Alma and Ellie received news from Mrs. Linda, an old neighbor who had witnessed several instances of Miranda's abuse. Mrs. Linda agreed to testify to support Alma and Ellie in court. "I always knew Miranda wasn't treating Ellie well, but I didn't know what to do," Mrs. Linda admitted when she met with Alma. "Now I want to stand up and protect her." Alma, moved, squeezed Mrs. Linda's hand tightly. Thank you so much, she said. Your help will be an important step forward. As news of Alma and Ellie's fight spread, more people in the community began to speak up in support. Some donated funds to help Alma with the legal battle, while others organized prayer gatherings and offered moral support. Ellie felt the warmth and support from those around her. I never thought so many people could care about me, she said to Alma, her voice full of emotion. Alma hugged Ellie tightly, tears brimming in her own eyes. You deserve to be loved, she said, and I believe we will win. Alma and Susan spent countless hours each day refining their legal strategy. They focused on presenting compelling evidence and highlighting inconsistencies in Miranda's testimony from the previous hearing. Miranda will try to rattle Ellie during the trial, Susan warned. We need to be mentally prepared for anything. Ellie nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. I won't let her scare me anymore, she said firmly. Alma felt a surge of hope rising within her. We've come so far, she said to Ellie, and I believe we will see this through to the end. On a peaceful evening before the trial, Alma and Ellie sat together in the living room, the flickering firelight from the hearth casting a warm glow on their faces. Are you afraid of the trial? Alma asked softly, her eyes filled with concern. Ellie thought for a moment before responding. I am scared, but I also have faith. I trust you, and I believe that we are doing the right thing. Alma smiled and took Ellie's hand. You are the bravest girl I have ever known, she said, her voice thick with emotion, and I promise I will always be by your side no matter what happens. Ellie leaned her head on Alma's shoulder, feeling the warmth and safety of her embrace. I love you, Grandma Alma, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes from deep emotion. I love you too, Ellie. Alma replied, her own eyes misty with tears. And I will do everything to make sure you have a happy life. David sat quietly in his small living room, staring at an old photograph of the three of them, him, his late wife Ellie's mother, and a young Ellie. The happiness captured in that photo was now a bittersweet memory. Since his wife's death, David had spiraled into despair and loss. He sought solace and work in his new life with Miranda, but that only drove a wedge between him and Ellie. David sighed, put the picture down on the table, and picked up his phone. He hesitated, but then decided to call Alma. I want to see Ellie, he said, his voice full of remorse. I want to apologize to her. Alma sensed the sincerity in David's voice, but she still had concerns. Ellie has been through a lot, David, she said. Are you ready to take responsibility and change? David nodded over the phone, his voice trembling. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I just hope Ellie can give me another chance. One afternoon, Alma took Ellie to the park where David had arranged to meet. Ellie walked slowly, her eyes full of anxiety. Do I have to see him, Grandma Alma, she asked, her voice quivering. Alma knelt down and looked into Ellie's eyes. You have the choice, she said gently. But I believe that sometimes forgiveness is not just for others, it's to set ourselves free. Ellie thought for a long moment, then took a deep breath. I'll try, she said, her voice resolute. When Ellie saw David from a distance, she stopped, her eyes filled with confusion. David approached, his expression full of remorse and regret. Hello, Ellie, he said, his voice trembling. I was wrong, so many mistakes. Ellie stayed silent, unsure of what to say. She looked down, her hands tightly intertwined. David continued, tears brimming in his eyes. I wasn't there when you needed me most. I let you endure so much pain and didn't know how to protect you. I'm so sorry. Ellie lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. Why did you let my stepmother do those things to me? Why didn't you protect me, she asked, her voice filled with bitterness and hurt. David lowered his head, his voice choked with emotion. I lost your mother, and I didn't know how to cope. I thought that by letting Miranda take charge, I could move past the pain. But that only pushed me further away from you and made you suffer. I was completely wrong. Ellie felt her heart shatter, a mix of anger and pain surging within her. I was so scared, she said, tears streaming down her face. I felt like no one cared about me. David was silent, his face buried in his hands. I know, and I'm so sorry, he said, his voice laden with regret. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I sincerely want to start over. I want to be a father you can trust. Ellie stood still for a long moment, her eyes conflicted. She remembered the long nights of fear, the times of abuse, and the feeling of abandonment. But at the same time, she saw the sincerity in David's eyes, a father full of remorse, eager to make amends. I don't know if I can forgive you, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I'm willing to give you a chance if you really want to change. David looked up, hope lighting his eyes. Thank you, Ellie, he said, his voice breaking. I'll do everything I can to prove that you can trust me again. After meeting David, Ellie returned home with mixed emotions. I don't know if I did the right thing, Grandma Alma, she said, staring into the distance. Alma smiled gently. There's no right or wrong in this, Ellie. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about freeing your heart from resentment. What matters is that you were brave enough to face your pain and give yourself a chance to heal. Ellie nodded, her eyes glistening with newfound trust. I'll try to open my heart to him, she said, her voice resolute. But I won't let him hurt me again. Alma hugged Ellie tightly, feeling proud of her. You've come so far, she said, and I believe you will find the happiness you deserve. In the weeks that followed, David made an effort to visit Ellie and Alma more often. He was no longer the distant father he once was, but instead became sincere and made every effort to understand and care for Ellie. One day, David brought Ellie an old book, a fairy tale collection that her mother used to read to her before bedtime. Your mom loved this book, he said, his voice full of affection. I thought we could read it together and remember her. Ellie took the book, her eyes filling with tears. I miss Mom, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. But I want to make new memories with you. David nodded, his eyes also glistening with tears. I want that too, Ellie, he said, and I won't lose you again. The process of rebuilding their bond wasn't quick, it was long and filled with challenges. Ellie still held on to her caution and anxiety, but she could feel David's sincerity and effort. One afternoon, when David visited Alma and Ellie, he brought a small painting of their family himself, Ellie, and her mother. I painted this hoping that we could rebuild a happy family, he said, his voice full of hope. Ellie looked at the painting and then turned to David. I'll try to trust you again, she said, her eyes bright. But I want you to promise that you will never abandon me again. David nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. I promise, he said. And I'll show you that with my actions. Alma sat quietly beside them, her eyes misting as she watched the reconciliation between Ellie and David. Sometimes, true love requires the courage to forgive, she thought. And they found a way to heal, not by forgetting the past, but by facing it. Ellie and David embraced, tears streaming down their faces not from pain, but from remorse and renewed trust. In that moment, Alma knew that part of Ellie's pain had been eased, and the journey to healing had truly begun. Alma, lawyer Susan, and Ellie intensified their efforts to prepare for the final court hearing. Alma worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, while Susan studied legal statutes and developed strategies to counter Miranda's lawyer. We have to be very cautious, Susan reminded Alma. Miranda will undoubtedly use every trick she has to regain custody of Ellie. Alma nodded, her eyes resolute. I'll do everything I can to protect Ellie, she affirmed. Ellie was no longer as afraid as she once was. She practiced answering tough questions and prepared herself for the intense cross-examination that Miranda's lawyer would likely subject her to. You've been through so much, Alma said to Ellie, tears in her eyes. But you are a true warrior. Ellie smiled, her eyes glistening with confidence. I will do my best, she affirmed, because I want to stay with you. The atmosphere in the courtroom was more stifling and tense than ever. Curious, anxious eyes of reporters, participants, and family members were all fixed on Ellie, Alma, and Miranda. Ellie sat next to Alma, her small hands tightly gripping Alma's. Are you sure you're ready? Alma asked, her voice worried but encouraging. Ellie nodded, her eyes glowing with determination. I'm ready, she said. I don't want you to fight alone. Susan began the trial with an emotional opening statement, focusing on Ellie's safety and well-being. Ellie's life has greatly improved under the care of Mrs. Alma, she emphasized. This case isn't just about custody, it's about protecting a child from abuse and fear. She presented a series of evidence, from social service records to testimony from neighbors and child protection workers. All of it supported the case for Ellie to remain with Alma. When it was Ellie's turn to testify, she walked to the stand slowly but confidently. The judge looked at her with an encouraging expression. Please tell the court about your life, he requested gently. Ellie took a deep breath and began to speak. I used to be very scared living with my stepmother, she said, her voice trembling. She didn't just hit me, she said things that made me feel worthless. The courtroom fell silent, listening intently to each word. But since I've been living with Grandma Alma, I've learned that I deserve to be loved, Ellie continued, her eyes shining with conviction. I want to stay with her because that's where I feel safe. Miranda's lawyer, Mr. Parker, approached with a cold gaze. Ellie, are you sure what you're saying is true? He asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Ellie looked straight into Parker's eyes, her voice unwavering. I'm not lying, she affirmed. I've lived in fear long enough and I don't want to go back there. Parker tried to shake her confidence with a series of rapid-fire questions, but Ellie held firm. I know what I went through, and I'm not afraid to tell the truth anymore, she responded, her eyes steady. Miranda took the stand with a composed, confident demeanor. I only wanted to teach the girl proper behavior, she defended. Maybe my methods were harsh, but it was all for her benefit. Susan stepped forward, her gaze locked on Miranda. So do you admit that you abused Ellie, she asked. Miranda hesitated for a moment, then replied, I only hit her when she was being very disobedient. Susan did not let this defense stand. Abuse is never the right way to discipline a child, she asserted. Ellie deserves love, not punishment. Amid the tense atmosphere, David unexpectedly stepped into the courtroom. He took the stand and admitted his failure to protect Ellie in the past. I know I was wrong, David said, his eyes red with emotion, but I believe that Mrs. Alma is the mother figure Ellie needs. Miranda was so enraged she couldn't contain herself. You're a traitor, she shouted. The judge demanded that Miranda remain calm and reminded everyone that each person had the right to speak the truth in this court. After hearing all the testimonies and reviewing the evidence, the judge made the final ruling. The official custody of Ellie will be granted to Mrs. Alma, he declared, his voice resolute. This decision is made in the best interest of Ellie. Ellie burst into tears of joy, hugging Alma tightly. We did it, she cried, her eyes sparkling. Alma couldn't hold back her tears either, embracing Ellie firmly. We did it, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Miranda stormed out of the courtroom, furious, while Alma and Ellie felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The long and arduous legal battle had finally led to a deserved outcome. After the trial concluded, Alma and Ellie began to build a new life filled with joy and hope. They worked together to renovate their home, creating a safe and cozy environment for Ellie. Ellie would often run around the garden, planting roses with Alma. I want to grow a garden full of roses so you can see them every morning, she said, her voice brimming with excitement. Alma smiled, her eyes sparkling with happiness. We'll do that, my dear, she replied. Ellie gradually adjusted to school and made new friends. She joined the drama club, where she could freely express herself. One evening after a school performance, Ellie ran to Alma with a beaming smile. Did you see how I did? She asked, her eyes shining. You were the brightest star, Alma said, holding Ellie close. I'm so proud of you. One day, Alma and Ellie decided to host a small party to invite Ellie's new friends and neighbors to celebrate. They decorated the house together, baked cakes, and prepared Ellie's favorite dishes. When everyone arrived, Ellie felt happier and more confident than ever. I never thought I could have a life like this, she confided to Alma. You deserve a life like this, Alma replied, her eyes sparkling with pride and joy. As time passed, Ellie and Alma gradually healed the wounds in their hearts. Ellie no longer had frequent nightmares, and she began to forgive David, though it wasn't easy to let go of the past. One day, David visited Ellie and Alma, bringing a book he had bought for his daughter. This is the book your mother used to read to you when you were little, he said, his eyes glistening with emotion. Ellie opened the book, tears welling in her eyes. I miss Mom, she said, her voice trembling with feeling. David held Ellie's hand tightly, his voice choked with emotion. I know, and I miss her too, he said, but I want to create new memories with you, if you'll give me a chance. Ellie smiled, tears rolling down her cheeks. I'll try, she said, her eyes lighting up with hope. One evening, as Alma and Ellie sat by the fire, Ellie turned to Alma with sincere eyes. Grandma Alma, I know I can't have a perfect family, but I'm so grateful for you. Alma hugged Ellie tightly, her voice trembling with emotion. You are the perfect family I've always wished for, she whispered. The life of Alma and Ellie was now a picture full of color and happiness. They planned little trips together, participated in community activities, and often hosted joyful parties with friends and neighbors. We've been through so much, Alma said to Ellie as they sat together watching the sunset. But from now on, we'll make happy memories together. Ellie smiled, her eyes full of trust and hope. I believe in the future, she said, because I know I have a real family. Alma held Ellie close, feeling the complete happiness and deep love they had built together. Thank you for following the heartfelt journey of Ellie and Alma. This story reminds us that love, perseverance, and courage can overcome any challenge. If you know someone who needs help or want to contribute to creating a safe environment for children, take action today. Share this video to spread a positive message, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Together, we can make the world a better place.